Her parents sold her on a rain-slicked shipyard, not because they didn't love her, but because they loved their own lives more. Subscribe for gripping, realistic Mafia crime stories, where power is tested, every mistake has a price, and a single moment can change everything. At midnight, in a desolate industrial dock, Irene T. Glisson was signed away like a stock option to settle her family's gambling debts. Betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect her, she was handed over to a predator who viewed her only as a prize. She expected a life of shadow and silence, a final, crushing descent into darkness. Instead, a ghost from the underworld emerged to tear up the contract. Acab Blanco Villalobos didn't save her to set her free. He claimed her to prove that no one touches what belongs to the white wolf. What follows is not a simple escape, but the dangerous evolution of a woman who was raised as a commodity, and the Mafia king who taught her that power is the only currency that matters. The rain didn't just fall, it punished. It hammered against the rusted hulls of shipping containers, a relentless staccato that drowned out Irene's ragged breathing. She stood in the center of a circle of predators, her hands clutched to her chest, feeling the damp weight of her disheveled hair against her neck. Before her, the lawyer, a man whose suit was too sharp for a place this filthy, held the document out like a death warrant. He didn't look at her face, he looked at the ink. "Sign here, Mr. Glisson," his voice as thin and cold as a razor blade. "And the debt is cleared. Your daughter belongs to Mr. Vance." Irene looked toward the shadows where her parents stood. Her mother's eyes were fixed on the oily puddles at her feet, her father's jaw set in a hard, cowardly line. They weren't looking at her, they were looking at their own freedom. The man named Vance stepped forward, a wet, hungry grin spreading across his face as he reached out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind Irene's ear. His fingers felt like slugs against her skin. Then the world went silent. It wasn't that the rain stopped, but rather that the atmosphere curdled. From the mouth of a dark alleyway between two containers, a figure emerged. He was tall, draped in a long obsidian coat that seemed to swallow the dim light of the overhead lamps. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, the gait of a man who had never needed to run from anything in his life. "The debt is not settled," a voice rang out, deep and resonant, carrying the weight of a funeral bell. Vance spun around, his hand dropping from Irene's face. "Who the hell are you? This is a private transaction." The man stepped into the light. His features were carved from granite, his eyes two chips of ice beneath a furrowed brow. This was Acab Blanco Villalobos, the man they whispered about in the high offices and the low gutters of the city. He didn't answer Vance. He didn't even look at him. His gaze was locked on Irene, a look of clinical, dominant appraisal that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "The Glissons owe me more than they owe you," Acab said quietly. He walked toward the lawyer, who began to stammer, lifting the folder as if it were a shield. Acab didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, a silenced pistol appeared from the folds of his coat. A soft thud echoed against the metal walls, and the lawyer's forehead bloomed with a sudden, neat crimson flower. He collapsed into the mud, the contract fluttering into a puddle, the ink blurring into nothingness. Irene's mother let out a strangled gasp, but Acab finally turned his head toward them. "Run," he commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a mercy he clearly didn't feel like giving twice. Her parents didn't look back. They vanished into the dark, leaving Irene alone in the center of a new, more terrifying storm. Vance began to reach for his waistband, but Acab was faster. He stepped into the smaller man's space, the barrel of the gun pressing firmly under Vance's chin. She is no longer merchandise, Acab whispered, his voice vibrating with a hidden tectonic violence. She is a Villalobos debt now. He lowered the weapon and looked at Irene. He didn't offer a hand. He simply turned his back, certain she would follow. "Come," he said. "The rain is starting to bore me." Irene looked at the body of the lawyer, then at the empty space where her family had been. With a shuddering breath, she stepped over the ruined contract and followed the shadow into the night. Irene awoke to a silence so absolute it felt heavy. There was no whistle of wind through cracked window panes, no rhythmic dripping of a leaky shipyard roof, and none of the jagged shouting that had defined her life in the Glisson household. Instead, there was only the faint, expensive scent of beeswax and old wood. She lay still, her heart hammering against her ribs as the memories of the previous night flooded back. The cold steel of the pistol, the lawyer's sudden collapse, and the dark silhouette of the man who had claimed her. She opened her eyes to find herself in a room that felt more like a cathedral than a bedroom. The ceiling was vaulted with dark timber beams, and the walls were lined with silk wallpaper the color of a bruised plum. When she tried to sit up, the sheets slid against her skin with a buttery softness that made her flinch. She was wearing a silk nightgown she didn't recognize, ivory and delicate. The realization hit her with a wave of nausea. Someone had undressed her while she was unconscious. Someone had handled her like a doll. She swung her legs over the edge of the high bed, her bare feet sinking into a rug so thick it felt like moss. Across the room, floor-to-ceiling windows were draped in heavy velvet, but a sliver of gray morning light managed to peek through. Irene crept toward it, pulling the fabric aside just enough to see out. The shipyard was gone. In its place was an estate that stretched into the mist. Manicured lawns gave way to dense pine forests, and a high stone wall topped with wrought iron spikes encircled the entire perimeter. Armed men in dark suits patrolled the gravel paths with a robotic precision that made her blood run cold. This wasn't a home, it was a fortress, and she was the newest acquisition stored within its walls. A soft click at the door made her spin around, her back hitting the cold glass. Acab Blanco Villalobos stood in the doorway. He had traded his long coat for a charcoal vest and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and etched with dark, intricate tattoos. He didn't enter the room, he simply occupied the threshold, his presence demanding the very air she was trying to breathe. "You slept for 12 hours, he said. His voice was no longer a roar, but a low, vibrating hum that seemed to settle in her bones. "My physicians said it was exhaustion. Your body finally gave up." Irene clutched the silk of her gown, her knuckles white. "Where are my parents?" Acab's expression didn't flicker. "They are exactly where they chose to be, far away from me and far away from you. They took the mercy I offered and ran. Do not waste your breath asking for them again." He stepped into the room then, his movements predatory and graceful. He stopped several feet away, his ice-blue eyes scanning her face, looking for the cracks in her resolve. "Vance is a dog who likes to chew on his toys until they break," Acab said quietly. "I do not break things, Irene. I keep them. I protect them. But make no mistake, you are in my house, under my name, and by my rules." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object, placing it on the mahogany dresser. It was her birth certificate and her passport, recovered from the lawyer's blood-soaked folder. He rested a large, scarred hand over the documents, effectively pinning her identity to the wood. "The world thinks you were sold to a monster, and perhaps you were, but here you are safe, and here you are mine." Irene looked from the documents to the man who held them. She had been traded from a man who wanted to destroy her to a man who wanted to own her. She had escaped the gutter only to find herself in a gilded cage, and the king of the underworld held the only key. The transition from the sanctuary of the bedroom to the dining hall felt like a descent into a den of wolves. The room was vast, dominated by a polished obsidian table that reflected the flickering light of a massive chandelier. A cob sat at the head, his posture regal and terrifyingly relaxed.
Around him sat 4 men, his generals, each bearing the scars of a lifetime spent in the service of violence. Their conversation, a low rumble of territory disputes and shipment losses, cut off the moment Irene entered. "Sit," Akab commanded, gesturing to the chair at his right hand. Irene felt the weight of their collective gaze, a mixture of derision, curiosity, and predatory intent. She sat, her spine stiff, her hands hidden beneath the table to conceal their trembling. A servant placed a plate of blood-red steak before her, but the aroma made her stomach turn. To these men, she was merely the shipyard girl, a decorative whim of their boss that cost them a profitable contract with Vance. "So, this is the prize?" one of the men, a thick-necked brute named Lorenzo, sneered. He didn't look at Akab. He stared directly at Irene, his eyes traveling over the silk of her dress with insulting slow pace. "A lot of trouble for a girl who looks like she'd break if the wind blew too hard. Vance is screaming for her head, Akab. Is she worth a war?" The table went silent. It was a challenge, a test of Akab's judgment disguised as a question about Irene's value. Akab didn't defend her. He simply picked up his wineglass, his eyes hooded and unreadable. He was leaving her to the wolves. "I don't break," Irene said. Her voice was thin, barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence. Lorenzo barked a laugh. "You don't break? You were sold by your own father for the price of a gambling debt. You've spent your life being handed from one hand to the next. You aren't a person, sweetheart. You're currency." He leaned forward, invading her space, the smell of cheap cigars and sweat rolling off him. "Tell me, currency, what do you do when the man holding you decides you're no longer worth the investment?" Irene felt the familiar coldness of the shipyard rain creeping back into her soul, but this time it didn't paralyze her. She looked at the steak knife beside her plate, sharp, silver, and steady. Then she looked at Lorenzo. She realized that these men feared Akab, but they didn't respect her because they thought she was still the girl in the puddles. "I do what I've always done," her voice growing steady, gaining a sharp, metallic edge. She leaned in, mimicking his posture until they were inches apart. "I survive. My father sold me because he was a coward who feared the dark. My parents are gone, Vance is a memory, and I am sitting at the right hand of the man who killed your lawyer without blinking. If I am currency, Lorenzo, I am the only coin in this room you can't afford to spend." Lorenzo's grin faltered. The other generals shifted in their seats, the air in the room suddenly charged with a different kind of tension. Akab set his wineglass down with a soft clink that sounded like a gavel.
"Eat your dinner, Lorenzo," Akab said softly, though the threat in his tone was unmistakable. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first Irene had seen. He turned to her, his hand briefly covering hers on the table. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a seal of approval. She had passed the first test. She hadn't just found her voice. She had used it as a blade. The piece of the Villalomos estate was a fragile glass sculpture, and it shattered 3 days later. Irene was in the library, tracing the gold-leafed spines of books she finally had the right to touch, when the heavy oak doors groaned open. Akab stood there, his face a mask of cold iron.
"Your past has returned," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "They are at the gate. They claim they made a mistake." Irene's heart performed a sickening roll in her chest. She followed him to the grand foyer, where the massive iron-studded doors stood open to the morning mist. There, shivering in the shadow of the stone archway, stood the two people who had looked at her like a line item on a ledger. Her mother's coat was damp, her face a map of desperate, practiced sorrow. Her father looked smaller than she remembered, his shoulders hunched as if trying to hide from the very air he breathed. "Irene! Oh, thank God!" her mother cried, reaching out with hands that had remained still when the lawyer signed Irene away. "We couldn't sleep. We realized we can't live without you. We found a way to make it right." Acab stepped aside, leaning against a marble pillar with his arms crossed. He watched them with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying insect. "They brought a gift," Acab murmured, his eyes flicking to the black sedan idling behind them. "A man named Silas, a different buyer, more money. They think they can refund my mercy and turn a higher profit elsewhere." The betrayal was so familiar it almost didn't hurt. It was a dull, rhythmic throb, like an old scar in the cold. Her father stepped forward, his voice a frantic whisper. "Irene, tell him you want to come with us. This man, he's a butcher. We've found someone better, someone who will treat you like the lady you are." Irene looked at them, really looked at them. She saw the greed masking as concern, the cowardice behind the tears. They didn't want her back, they wanted the commission. Acab walked toward her. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached into the small of his back and pulled out a sleek, black matte handgun. He held it out to her, the grip toward her hand. The weight of it was surprising, cold, heavy, and absolute. "You are a Villalobos debt now, Irene," Acab said, his voice a low vibration in her ear. "And in this house, we settle our own accounts. You can go with them and be the coin they spend, or you can show them that you are no longer for sale. The choice and the steal is yours." The foyer went deathly silent. Her mother's sobbing stopped abruptly. Her father took a step back, his eyes widening as Irene's fingers closed around the textured grip. It was the first time in her life she had held power that wasn't granted by someone else's permission. Irene raised the weapon. It didn't tremble. She didn't aim at their hearts, she aimed at the gravel at their feet. Crack! The sound was a thunderclap that echoed off the high ceilings. Her parents shrieked, scrambling backward as stone chips sprayed their shoes. "I was never your daughter," Irene said, her voice steady and terrifyingly calm. "I was only ever your insurance policy. Consider it cancelled." She handed the gun back to Acab without looking away from them. "Get out. If I see you again, I won't aim for the ground." As they scrambled into their car and fled into the fog, Irene felt something shift deep inside her. The disheveled girl from the shipyard was dead. She turned to Acab, finding him watching her with an expression that was almost like pride. "Well done," he whispered. "Now, let's go inside. You have a legacy to build." The smell of gunpowder and ozone clung to Acab like a second skin when the heavy front doors were thrown open. It was past midnight, and the rain had returned, turning the gravel drive into a river of silt. Acab didn't walk in so much as he was poured into the foyer, his weight supported by two of his silent, grim-faced guards. His white shirt was no longer white. It was a map of visceral, spreading crimson, the fabric torn by the jagged passage of lead. "Ambush at the docks," one of the guards grunted, his eyes darting toward the stairs. "Moretti's men, we need the doctor." "The doctor is 40 minutes away," Irene said, her voice cutting through the panic like a blade. She had been waiting in the shadows of the library, and now she stepped forward, her movements precise.
She didn't flinch at the sight of the blood. She had seen her own blood spilled on linoleum floors back in the Glisson house. She knew the smell of it, the heat of it. Bring him to the study, now. They laid him out on the leather sofa, his breath coming in shallow, wet rattles. Acab's face was the color of ash, his jaw clenched so tightly the bone looked ready to snap. As the guards hesitated, hovering with useless hands, Irene looked at them with a coldness she had inherited from the man bleeding out before her. Get out, fetch hot water and the kit from the infirmary, and move. When the room cleared, she was alone with the white wolf. She knelt beside him, her hands steady as she began to cut away the ruined silk of his shirt. Acab's hand suddenly shot out, his fingers locking around her wrist with a grip that was still terrifyingly strong, despite his weakness. "Run, Irene," he rasped, a fleck of blood dancing on his lip. "The walls, they're thin. If I fall tonight, this house becomes a tomb. Take the keys from the desk. There's a car. Go."
Irene didn't pull away. She leaned closer, her eyes locked onto his, mirroring the icy intensity of his own. "I've spent my life running from small men, Acab. I'm not running from the only one who treated me like a person." She pried his fingers loose and set to work. She used the whiskey from the sideboard to cleanse the jagged entry wound in his shoulder, her face splattered with the red spray of his pain. She didn't look away when he groaned, a sound like grinding tectonic plates. As she packed the wound and stitched the skin with a needle that felt too small for such a large man, she noticed the ledgers spilled across the desk nearby, knocked over in the chaos. Between the agonizing moments of care, her eyes drifted to the pages. She saw names, roots, and numbers, the intricate, bloody architecture of the Villalobos Empire. She realized then that Acab wasn't just a man of violence, he was a man of cold, brilliant mathematics. "Is this how you do it?" she whispered, tightening a bandage as his breathing finally began to level out. "You don't just kill them, you outcalculate them." Acab opened his eyes, the fever of the wound clouding them, yet he tracked her movement. He saw her looking at his secrets, and for the first time he didn't close the book. He reached out a trembling hand, trailing a bloody thumb along her jawline. "Numbers don't lie, Irene," he breathed. "People do. If you're staying, you'll need to learn how to read the truth." In the quiet of the blood-stained study, Irene didn't just save his life, she claimed her place in it. She wasn't just a ward or a guest anymore. She was a student of the dark, sitting at the feet of a wounded king, watching the shadows for the first sign of the coming war. The healing process was slow, but it was not silent. As the color returned to Acab's face, the study became a classroom. The heavy mahogany desk, once a barrier between Irene and the world of shadows, was now a shared workbench. Acab sat in the high-backed leather chair, his arms still cradled in a sling, while Irene sat beside him, her fingers stained of the ink of a dozen ledgers. He didn't treat her like a conquest or a porcelain doll to be shielded. Instead, he spoke to her with a grueling, professional intensity. He showed her how the Villalobos Empire was built, not just on bullets, but on the quiet flow of capital. He pointed to names on a payroll, judges, dock workers, and rival lieutenants, explaining that every man had a price, and the trick was knowing whether they wanted to be paid in gold or in fear. "A man who fears you will eventually grow desperate enough to kill you, but a man who owes you, he will keep you alive to ensure he can keep breathing. Look at these figures, Irene. Tell me where the lie is." Irene leaned over the columns of numbers, her mind racing to keep pace with his. She traced a finger down a list of shipping manifests from the North Docks. Something didn't align.
The weight of the crates coming in didn't match the fuel consumption of the trucks going out. It was a small discrepancy, a fraction of a percentage, but in this world, a fraction was a crack where a traitor could hide. "Here," she said, her voice steady. "Lorenzo's route. He's skimming from the logistics end. He's making it look like mechanical waste, but the math says he's selling the surplus to a third party." Akab leaned back, a cold, sharp glint of pride appearing in his eyes. "Good. Most men look for the smoking gun. You looked for the missing ink." The lesson shifted from the books to the men that evening. Akab called the generals into the study, including Lorenzo. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of rain and tobacco. Irene didn't retreat to the corner. She stood at Akab's shoulder, her posture a mirror of his own. When Lorenzo began to bluster about the unfortunate losses at the docks, Akab didn't interrupt. He simply slid the ledger across the desk toward Irene. "Explain the deficit to him, Irene," Akab commanded. The room went still. Lorenzo's face twisted in a sneer, his eyes darting to the girl he had once called currency. "I don't take orders from a shipyard stray, Akab. Send her away so we can talk business." "She isn't leaving," Akab said, his voice dropping to that terrifying tectonic hum. "And if you can't answer her questions, you won't be leaving either." Irene stepped forward, the weight of the ledgers no longer feeling like a burden, but a weapon. She spoke with a surgical precision, laying out the mathematical proof of Lorenzo's betrayal in front of the other men. She didn't shout, she didn't need to. The numbers did the screaming for her. By the time she finished, Lorenzo was no longer sneering. He was sweating, his eyes fixed on the silver letter opener on the desk. Akab reached out, his uninjured hand covering Irene's on the desk. It was a public declaration. He wasn't just keeping her, he was crowning her. She was no longer an acquisition. She was the architect of his order, the woman who saw the blood between the lines. As the guards led a trembling Lorenzo out, Irene realized that she had stopped looking for the exit. She was finally learning that the only way to never be sold again was to be the one who owned the ledger. The silence of the estate was not the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary. It was the coiled tension of a predator waiting for the snap of a twig. It came at 3 a.m, a sudden jarring percussion of glass shattering in the grand foyer, and the muffled thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire. The darkness of the bedroom was instantly sliced by the crimson sweep of emergency lights. Irene didn't scream. She didn't hide under the silk sheets that had once felt like a shroud. She rolled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor with purpose, and reached for the heavy robe Akab had given her. Before she could reach the door, it burst open. Akab was there, his silhouette jagged and fierce against the pulsing red light. He was fully dressed, a tactical vest cinched over his black shirt, a rifle held with the casual familiarity of an old friend. "Vance," Irene whispered, the name tasting like ash. "He brought the Moretti remnants," Akab said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "They're not here for territory. They're here for a trophy. They've breached the north wall." He moved toward her, his hand cupping the back of her neck for a fleeting, bruising second. "The panic room is behind the library. Go. Now." "No," Irene said, her voice steady enough to surprise them both. "If I hide, I'm just property waiting to be found. I stay with you." Akab looked at her, searching for the girl who had trembled in the shipyard rain. He didn't find her. He saw the woman who had balanced his ledgers and stitched his skin. He reached into his waistband and pulled out a sleek handgun, slapping it into her palm. "Keep the safety off. Aim for the center of the chest." They moved through the corridors like twin shadows. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and the metallic tang of blood. Downstairs, the house was a war zone. The sounds of boots on marble and the guttural shouts of men echoed through the vents. As they reached the gallery overlooking the foyer, Irene saw him. Vance stood amidst the wreckage of a shattered Ming vase, looking bloated and grotesque in a tactical jacket that didn't fit. He held a shotgun, his eyes wide with a frantic, drug-fueled mania. He wasn't looking for ACAB. He was screaming her name, his voice cracking with the desperation of a man who had lost his pride and thought her body could buy it back. "I paid for you," Vance shrieked, firing a senseless round into a portrait on the wall. "You're mine, Irene. Come out and I'll kill him quick." ACAB stepped to the railing, but a spray of gunfire from Vance's mercenaries forced him back into the cover of a stone pillar. "He's obsessed," ACAB hissed, reloading his rifle. "He's a dog with a bone he can't chew." Irene looked at the gun in her hand, then at the man who had taught her that numbers and power were the only truths. She realized Vance didn't see the fortress, or the guards, or the white wolf. He only saw the disheveled girl who had clutched her chest in the rain. He was blinded by his own arrogance, a mathematical error she knew exactly how to exploit. "Let him come closer," Irene whispered, her eyes tracking Vance's erratic movement toward the stairs. "He thinks he's coming to claim a prize. He doesn't know he's walking into a debt he can't settle." ACAB looked at her, a dark, lethal smile touching his lips. He signaled his men to hold their fire. The trap was set. The pervert had returned for his merchandise, but he was about to find out that Irene T. Glisson was no longer for sale. The chaos of the siege descended into a symphony of controlled violence. Below, ACAB moved with the lethality of a storm, his rifle spitting fire as he and his men held the grand staircase against the wave of Moretti's mercenaries. The air was a thick, choking fog of drywall and sulfur. Every time a muzzle flashed, Irene saw the silhouette of the man who had claimed her, standing his ground, refusing to let the darkness reclaim what he had protected. But the predator Irene feared wasn't below. He was behind her. Vance had circled through the service corridor, his heavy, uneven footsteps echoing against the marble floor of the darkened gallery. He was panting, a wet, desperate sound that set Irene's teeth on edge. She ducked behind a heavy mahogany display case, her heart hammering not with the frantic rhythm of a victim, but with the cold, calculating pulse ACAB had taught her to cultivate. "Irene!" Vance roared, the sound followed by the splintering of wood as he swung his shotgun blindly into a doorframe. "I know you're here, you little thief. You're coming back to the shipyard. I don't care if I have to drag you back in pieces." Irene looked down at the handgun in her lap, then at the heavy leather folder she had snatched from the study, the procedural documents the lawyer had used to sell her. She realized then that Vance didn't just want her. He wanted the validation of the contract. He wanted the world to agree that she was his. "Vance," she called out. Her voice was steady, devoid of the tremors he expected. "You want the papers? You want the proof that I'm yours?" The footsteps stopped. "Slide them out," he hissed, his voice trembling with greed. "Slide them out and come into the light, and maybe I won't let the boys have a turn before we leave." Irene didn't slide the papers. She stood up slowly, keeping the display case between them, holding the folder high so the red emergency lights caught the white glare of the pages. "The lawyer is dead, Vance. The debt was settled in blood. But these say I'm worth 5 times what you paid. Is that why you came back? Or is it because you know that without a piece of paper, you're nothing?" She began to move toward the balcony's edge, luring him away from the shadows and toward the open expanse where the railing had been shattered.
Vance followed, his eyes fixed on the folder, his weapon lowered just an inch as his hunger for the merchandise overwhelmed his caution. "Give it to me," he growled, lunging forward. Irene didn't pull the trigger, not yet. She tossed the folder into the air, the pages scattering like white birds in the wind. As Vance instinctively reached out to grab the fluttering documents, his footing slipped on the slick, debris-covered marble. He stumbled, his chest hitting the broken railing. In that heartbeat, the girl from the shipyard died for good. Irene raised the handgun, her gaze tracking him over the sights with the surgical precision of a ledger entry. "I am not currency," she whispered. She pulled the trigger. The recoil was a sharp, honest jolt up her arm. The bullet found its mark in the center of his chest. The force of it sent him backward, over the edge of the gallery and into the void of the foyer below. He fell in silence, landing among the wreckage of the life he had tried to steal. Irene stood at the edge, looking down. Below, ACAB lowered his rifle, his eyes meeting hers through the rising smoke. There was no more prey in the house. There was only the partner who had settled the final debt. The morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy gray shroud hanging over the city, but the light that did break through was clean, washing away the copper tang of the night's violence. Inside the estate, the frantic energy of the siege had settled into a rhythmic, professional hum. Men in dark suits moved through the foyer, efficiently clearing the wreckage of Vance's ambition, while the smell of strong coffee began to replace the lingering scent of cordite. Irene stood in the center of the study, the very room where she had first learned the language of power. She was no longer wearing the ivory silk nightgown or the borrowed robe of a refugee. She wore a tailored suit of charcoal wool, her dark hair pulled back in a sharp, uncompromising line. On the desk before her lay the updated ledgers, the ones she had corrected, the ones that now reflected a world without the rot of Lorenzo or the shadow of Vance. ACAB entered the room with a slow, measured step. His shoulder was bandaged beneath his shirt, but he moved with the renewed vitality of a man who had seen his legacy secured. He didn't stop at the door or wait for an invitation. He walked directly to her, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He didn't look at the desk. He looked at her face, searching for any trace of the girl he had bought in the rain. "The Moretti family has gone silent," ACAB said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "The vacuum Vance left behind is already being filled by people who know better than to look toward this house. The city is quiet, Irene, for now." Irene closed the ledger, the sound a final, decisive click. "Quiet isn't the same as loyal, ACAB. We have 3 routes in the south that need restructuring, and the dock workers need to know that the hand holding the pen has changed." ACAB's lips curved into that rare, lethal ghost of a smile. He reached out, not to claim her or to pin her identity down, but to rest his hand on the desk beside hers, an offering of space. "Then we should tell them." He led her out through the French doors onto the wide stone balcony that overlooked the sprawling grit of Chicago. From this height, the city looked like a vast, intricate clockwork of steam and steel, a machine they now controlled. The wind whipped at Irene's coat, but she didn't flinch or huddle into herself. She leaned into the breeze, her gaze scanning the horizon with a cold, architectural clarity. She thought of her parents, wandering somewhere in the gray distance, still looking for someone to sell. She thought of the shipyard, a ghost of a life she could no longer imagine living. Beside her, the white wolf stood tall, his presence no longer a shadow that loomed over her, but a pillar that stood with her. "They used to call me property," Irene murmured, her voice carrying over the edge of the stone. "They were wrong," ACAB replied, his eyes fixed on the city they would now shape together. "You were always the queen. You just needed a kingdom to prove it." Irene reached out, her fingers lacing through his. It wasn't a gesture of a victim seeking a savior, but of a partner sealing a pact. In the world of shadows, love was a dangerous currency. But as they stood together overlooking their domain, she knew they were the only ones who could afford the price. The reign of the Villalobos had begun, and for the first time in her life, Irene T. Glisson was exactly where she belonged. The story of Irene T. Glisson and Acab Blanco Villalobos is more than a tale of survival in the criminal underworld. It is a profound exploration of human agency and the true nature of value. Through their journey, the narrative reveals several vital moral truths. The reclamation of self-worth. The most powerful lesson lies in Irene's transformation from currency to architect. For years, Irene was told her only value was what she could provide for others, a bargaining chip for her parents, or a trophy for a predator. The story teaches that our worth is not a price tag assigned by others, but a power we claim for ourselves. By mastering the books and choosing to stay and fight, Irene proves that being sold does not make one merchandise. One's past does not dictate their potential. Even a soul treated as barren soil can grow into a kingdom if given the right environment of respect and purpose. The distinction between possession and partnership. Acab Blanco Villalobos represents a subversion of the monster archetype. While the world saw Irene as an object to be bought, Acab treated her as an asset to be developed. The moral here is that true strength does not come from crushing others into submission, but from empowering them to stand beside you. Acab didn't save Irene to make her a slave. He gave her the tools, the gun, the ledgers, and the knowledge to save herself. Their new reign is a testament to the idea that the strongest bonds are not built on forced contracts, but on mutual respect and shared competence. The failure of betrayal as survival. Irene's parents serve as a cautionary tale. They believed that selling their daughter was a necessary evil to save themselves, but in doing so, they lost the only thing of actual value they possessed: their humanity and their legacy. Their eventual flight into the fog highlights a grim reality, that those who treat people as disposable eventually find themselves disposed of by the world. They traded a daughter for a debt and ended up with nothing, while Irene traded her fear for a crown. Choice over circumstance. Finally, the story posits that we are not defined by what happens to us in the shadows, but by the choices we make when we step into the light. Irene had every reason to be a victim, yet she chose to be a predator of the predators. The moral of the story is that no matter how many times you have been signed away, sold, or discarded, you always hold the final pen. You are the only one who can settle your own accounts, and the only one who can decide who you belong to. In the end, Irene and Acab's story reminds us that even in a world governed by blood and debt, the most valuable thing one can own is their own soul. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to follow every shocking twist in this story.